Hello, everybody. Welcome to this week's edition of Daily Coast. The Brief. I'm Markos and Kerry Aleveld is back after several months away in maternity leave. Kerry, how are the baby and mom?
Well,
Moms, you too.
we are alive. Yes. So anyways, our little family's getting along, and I'm mildly sleep deprived, which is to be expected. But the little guy's doing fine. Big sister's doing fine. So our Lucy, our dog, is doing fine. So it's just a matter of right. It's just a matter. Everybody's fed. Everybody's getting baths and all that stuff. So yes.
So excited to have you back.
Kerry, I just want to say I feel very lucky to have been able to take parental leave. It's such a godsend. But anyway, go ahead, please.
No, that's awesome. But you did pick a very interesting time to go and have a baby and take time off because Kerry, we've been talking about the collapse of the Republican Party and how 2022 would not be a typical midterm, and everything we talked about is coming true.
Can I just say, I should go on vacation more often because I feel like I feel it was like a gift that I went on vacation. My whole beat exploded, and just before I left, I was still writing pieces. Like I remember a specific headline that I wrote within a week before I left that was "Take heart: Democrats will overperform expectations in November." And I wasn't saying exactly what that would be. I thought the Senate, we would keep the Senate, but I was just saying we're going to overperform. I can't tell you by how much, but just don't listen to the pundits. And then I go away and everything changes.
So speaking of the pundits, I think we should bring our guest on right now. Our guest today is Simon Rosenberg. He is the head of New Democrat Network, an old friend. He actually wrote the foreword to my first book, Crashing the Gate. We had this sort of inside-outside game going, and it was in those early years of the Netroots. It was amazing. And Simon, first of all, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
It's great to be here, guys. Thank you so much.
So Simon is I think perfect, Kerry, because there was I think four of us as individuals that were really looking early in the cycle last year, saying this is not going to be a typical midterm election. Obviously, we were talking about that. We were talking about Donald Trump staying on stage, so it could not be a referendum on Joe Biden if Donald Trump wasn't getting off the stage. And also, we were talking about the abortion decision. Simon, and we'll talk about it. Simon was right there also looking at hard numbers. And the other one was Joe Trippi, which we've had on the show before. And Simon, I saw that you were just on Joe Trippi's podcast. So it's like small group of us that are suddenly feeling very vindicated. And I just want to make clear that we're not declaring victory, but we were from the beginning saying this is not a wave year. And Kerry, you were there, right? We were there.
Well, I was adamant for different reasons. I tell you, I'll tell you why I became an adherent and follower of what Simon Rosenberg's been doing, because I was like, I just could see how, based on my coverage of the LGBTQ movement from about the mid-aughts, 2005 to 2015, when we secured same-sex marriage rights through the Supreme Court decision, which of course is now in flux, right? We still have marriage rights, but the Supreme Court is wildly crazy now and outside of the mainstream, and who knows what they could do, right? So hopefully we're going to codify that through the Senate in the next couple of weeks. I think that's a real possibility here. But one of the things that I was really clear about was that there's nothing like losing rights to ignite people, to just animate them and enrage them. And LGBTQ activists were enraged after, Barack Obama got, which most of us were very happy about, got elevated to the highest office of the land, first American Black president. And at the same night, we had Proposition 8 pass, and rights were, marriage rights that same-sex couples enjoyed across the state were taken away. And what every gay and transgender person knew across the country, they knew that meant that if it could happen in California, it could happen anywhere. And that we were all like on the chopping block, basically. Any right that we had, whether it was in employment or it was in, marriage rights, et cetera. And I was convinced that would just have that the overturning of Roe would have an epic effect that people were vastly underestimating. And that these stories, where one of the big differences between the movements of the abortion rights movement and the LGBTQ movement is that there were tons of stories of people being kicked out of the military and people, being denied being able to be at their partner's bedside, that were just enraging, and that were very righteous stories that the press was happy to tell, and that we were happy to share. And it was just the abortion rights movement. Most of the stories seemed sort of like it was sort of scarce, and they were sort of wrapped in a little bit of shame. And now we see what a difference the stories are, right? These are righteous stories. These are enraging stories. People are happy to share them because they cannot believe that a 10-year-old has to cross state lines in order to, get an abortion after getting pregnant through rape. A 10-year-old. No one can believe that. And no one can believe that people are being forced to carry to term because, even though their baby might not live, for a day or two, or that the health of the mother is actually in jeopardy and jeopardized by not being able to get an abortion, which is sort of basic health care. So these stories have just turned this so quickly. And I was convinced that was going to happen. Then I discovered Simon Rosenberg. Sorry, I know this is a long intro, but then I started watching, and he was coming at it. I was coming at it from a movement perspective. He was coming at it from being a campaign operative and being a strategist and looking at the numbers. And he started putting numbers to what I was felt was certain, but couldn't 100% convince people of. So please, Simon, tell us what you were seeing.
Yeah, sure. And listen, thank you so much. And Markos, my brother, it's great to see you. And we haven't actually seen each other in person in a long time. So listen, I wrote a piece in November of last year saying that 2022 was likely not to be a typical midterm because Republicans had made what I thought was a really dangerous political decision, which is they ran towards MAGA. They ran towards a politics that had just been rejected twice by the American people in overwhelming numbers. And I don't know if people know this, but we won those last two elections by 6.5 points. That's a big margin in our business. And more people voted against MAGA in 2018 and 2020 than any political movement in American history. So the smart thing for Republicans to have done, to have secured a strong midterm, would to have distanced themselves from MAGA. But we know they've been overrun by extremism and extremists, and they ran towards this, or the American Taliban, as Markos called it a long time ago, right?
And got yelled at by liberals.
Yelled at by everybody. But that's what happens, Markos, when you're ahead of the curve, right? Is that so the question always was in my mind was, would this fear of MAGA, which drove the last two elections, once again drive this election? And what was going to be the set of triggers that would remind the anti-MAGA majority about why they had voted against the Republican Party twice? And what happened was, in the spring, there was a series of things that happened. There was, Uvalde, and there were mass shootings, and there was the ending of Roe, there was the abortion restrictions, there was, the SCOTUS looking like it had sort of gone crazy. January 6th committee revelations, which established that there was a vast conspiracy by all the leaders of the Republican Party to overturn an American election. All of that all happened together. And I think what it did is that it shook up the electorate, reminded this anti-MAGA majority why they didn't vote for Republicans last time. And as you pointed out, so I wrote a piece before Roe ended saying there's no red wave. There was no evidence of a red wave. Republicans were actually, in my view, underperforming across the country in polling. I was a little surprised, frankly, at what I was seeing in the limited public polling that we had at that time. And then Roe ended, and there became very, very quickly the election changed. And even just 4 days after Roe ended, on the Tuesday afterwards, on the 28th of June, there was a special election in Nebraska where we overperformed our 2020 numbers by 10 points. I mean, that's a huge overperformance. I mean, overperforming your 2020 numbers in a red wave year by anything was going to be a lot, but we overperformed by 10
Simon,
points. Yeah.
And I just, for context, people might know that there's a sort of swing district in Nebraska. It's the one that Joe Biden won in 2020. This was not the swing district. This was a red exurban rural district.
Right.
So it was even more shocking.
And I think that was discounted by the political class completely as being an outlier. And yet it turns out it was a harbinger, right? It was a signal that something had dramatically changed in the election. And we've now had 5 House special elections, and we've overperformed our 2020 numbers in those 5 districts by an average of 7 points. And Markos, to your point, this includes in states like Alaska and, in Minnesota and upstate New York, not just in liberal places. And so, I think that the most important data about the election is voting. Voting always matters more than polling or anything else. And in the 5 House specials and the Kansas vote that took place, we've dramatically outperformed expectations and outperformed even our own polling. In the New York 19 race, I talked to the DCCC that afternoon, and they said they thought we were going to lose by 3 to 4 points. And so they were shocked that we ended up winning that seat by almost 2.5 points. And so and now Tom Bonnier, who's a wonderful guy who runs this group called Target Smart, has now crunched the numbers, and they found that there's been a huge surge in women voting in these elections, obviously, in registering. The registration numbers have shifted much more Democratic since June 24th across the country. And in those states where you can request an early ballot, women are way outperforming their normal distribution in the electorate in those states. And so you see this women are energized, particularly young women, and they're obviously lean much more Democratic. And I think what we're seeing is this data kind of align, where you're seeing the public data, the polling, the election results, the registration numbers, all of this is telling the same story, which is that this is a very competitive, even a lean Democrat election at this point, and that we've come a long way from where we were. We've got a real shot at keeping both chambers if we do the work, and as Joe Trippi likes to say, and they keep doing the crazy.
Yeah, last week's episode, we talked about New York 19. And what was amazing about that is that, first of all, it was a 50-48 Biden district. So this is a 50-50 district. If Republicans are going to take the House, they need to win districts like New York 19. It's just there's 222 seats in the House that are more Democratic than New York 19. And you only need 217 to hold the majority. But what was even more amazing is that Republicans spent over $1 million and Democrats spent, I think, $50,000, because it's a seat that goes away in 5 months. It wasn't worth it for Democrats to spend money on a seat that disappears. But Republicans wanted the statement, I guess. And despite the money, despite having their best candidate anywhere in the country in that seat, and despite Democrats sort of writing it off because it didn't matter, we still outperformed Joe Biden numbers in that district slightly, but without even trying.
Yeah, and we outperformed our own polling. And I will tell you from talking to reporters, the Republicans were telling everybody that they were going to win that race. And so that also created an enormous credibility problem for the Republican political class back here about whether they were, because they misled or they looked foolish to a lot of reporters who cover this stuff every day. The Democrats were downplaying that race, significantly, not just in public, but even to people like me. I mean, I was the lead strategist for the DCCC in the 2018 cycle. So even though I've been doing this a long time, I've been in the game at a national level, recently, right, in this new post-Trump environment. And so it's a dramatic result. But I think the bottom line for your viewers is that this is a competitive election, and that the work that we do between now and election day, we all know that elections can change, things can turn out differently than we expected. We don't need to be lectured on that, but it's competitive now. We've been given an opportunity. And I think if I had to handicap about whether things will get a little bit better for the Democrats or a little bit better for the Republicans, I still think it's much more likely that we pick up another point or two nationally, which will improve our position even more. I mean, the fact that Joe Biden's approval rating has come back by more than 10 points in recent weeks was something that nobody really anticipated, right? In terms of, at least at that speed and rapidity. I think the party committees were hopeful he'd get to 45 by election day. I mean, he's already at 44. And so he could actually end up being in a stronger place than is sort of the models in what we are anticipating, in the election. So I'm very optimistic. And certainly I think the last thing I'll say is that what is a little bit under the radar screen in the political commentary is that if you look at the June 30th filings for money, our House incumbents had an 8-to-1 cash in hand advantage over their Republican, and the Republican incumbents only had a 2-to-1 cash in hand advantage. And yes, there's a lot of other money in the system, but if you had to choose to have your candidates with more money or your outside groups with more money, you choose to have your candidates have more money. They can make late changes. They're close to the things that are on the ground. They're not doing these cookie cutter ads from some headquarters far away. They're often able to surf these changes in the final 2 months far better. So we'd much rather be in the financial position that we're in as opposed to them, which is why on virtually every way you look at this election, I'd rather be us than them right now.
Absolutely. Can I just so we could say a lot of things about Republican money right now, Rick Scott and the National Republican Senatorial Committee canceling millions of dollars in ads, the infighting between Mitch McConnell and Trump and Rick Scott and billionaire donor Peter Thiel, all that stuff, right? We could go on and on about that, but I don't want to underestimate I want to stay a little bit on Democrats because it's so easy to pile on Republicans right now, right?
Yeah.
Can you just talk for a second about the difference in posture it makes after we win New York 19 unexpectedly by 6 points more than what they thought, what the internal House numbers were showing?
I think this is really important because, this is my 17th election cycle, right? As a Democrat, I've been doing this. I know it's hard to believe I've been doing this. I know. I joke. I used to be Yoda, and now I'm. I used to be Luke, and now I'm Yoda, right? This issue about whether or not you think you're going to win, and your confidence, it really matters, right? These are intangibles in our business that it's like in a sports team or a company, the sense of are we together? Is the team together? Are we working together? Does it feel good, right? It felt really bad 2 months ago. I mean, inside the Democratic thing, the fighting over BBB, the Biden's low approval rating, the fear of Republicans, whatever it all was, I had almost never seen such a negative internal culture as we were feeling inside the Democratic Party in Washington as we were just a few months ago. And so we were playing defense. We were trying not to lose the election as opposed to trying to win the election. And there's a big difference. And I think in politics, if you're not on offense, you're losing. I don't think there really is. I think defense is dangerous, in the political environment. You've got to have a strategy to win. And to play to win if you're going to win, right? And I think what's changed psychologically in Washington Democratic, campaign circles is we now believe we can win, and then that creates a whole series of changes about allocation of resources and whether you just trust data or are you more confident in your candidates, because each person in the food chain, each campaign manager, each field organizer, each candidate now feels a little bit more confidence that we can pull this thing off. That's what New York 19 did. New York 19 really injected a sense that, man, we can do this, and I can just feel it in my day-to-day interactions with everybody. And let me give you another example of that. Historically, the party committees are very careful about not overcommitting to races that they're not really sure they can win. And in the Senate, those are races like Florida, North Carolina, Ohio, which were not races that we really believed were going to be competitive a few months ago. And just in the last 10 days, the Senate has launched this thing they call the Flippable Five, which is the 5 Republican seats that they think they can flip. And they've made this now a national fundraising campaign. That is one of the most aggressive things that I've ever seen a party committee do in all my years of being in this business, where they're not just worrying about defending the 4, but now they're talking about the flippable 5. And I will tell you, that's a sign of that we're reaching and we're going for it, not being, reckless and silly, right? Because I think this conservatism was too much baked into the cake already. but I think that there's a confidence that we've gained. And frankly, I think the passage of the climate and health reconciliation bill was really critical to bringing the family together. A family that had been a little bit at odds with one another. I think this was a great way for Joe Biden to close. I think we are now more unified than we've been in years as Democrats. And we have something really powerful to sell. I mean, look, we have a big argument to make about how we've made the country better. What is their argument, right? That if you elect us, we're going to make sure you don't have elections anymore. I mean, they don't really have, they don't have a compelling narrative any longer. And the Washington Post had a great story yesterday about the Republicans going through another reboot on their messaging.
What about 6 weeks out?
Yeah, right. No, that's the point, Marcos. Like that's the equivalent of the Russians getting, going into retreat, right? In Ukraine, right? I mean,
they're just regrouping. They're just regrouping, right? Not retreating. It's regroup. Right. Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's very good. Well done, Kerry. And so.
I would add debt relief, student debt relief to that list of really sort of bringing people together. And it's amazing how calm things are on the left. Like, going from freaking out about Joe Biden to like, Kerry, you have something?
Yeah, well, let me say one quick thing about student debt relief. So I've been listening, podcasts are an easy way for me to take in information while I'm changing diapers and, like whatever. So I've been listening just a slew of podcasts. And, every Republican commentator I listen to is convinced that student debt relief was a disaster for Biden.
Right.
And I'm like, they're completely underestimating the fact that you have to get your base to turn out. Not to mention listening to Hacks on Tap, David Axelrod saying, I don't know about this. I was like, Axe, do you remember 2010 when you guys lost and got a shellacking because the base stayed at home, right? This is a huge base motivator. And I just want to add that to the conversation because Republican commentators, as much as they're even never Trumpers who are willing to say, our candidates suck, and that's a problem, right? But they're convinced that the student debt relief thing was bad news for Biden. And I'm like, listen, no one in the suburbs who is concerned about abortion is going to change their vote because of student debt relief, 10,000 to 20,000 in student debt relief. That's not happening. So, Simon,
and I think, and Marcos, you and I talked about this before we came on, or just, I guess, over text, is that think about young people, right? And what's happened in the last few months. And young people are this overwhelmingly Democratic part of our coalition. And they also are the least likely to show up in the midterms, and also had, we know from polling, enormous distance from Joe Biden, right? They felt very distant from him. And Biden had really lost an enormous amount of ground with young people over the last 2 years. Well, look what's happened now. You had the mass shootings that took place. We passed a major piece of bipartisan gun legislation, which I still think we all forget actually happened, which is almost like an unbelievable miracle that Republicans were so scared about what they were seeing that they agreed to do gun legislation, right? And then you had the ending of Roe, which disproportionately affects young people in the United States. And then you had this massive the biggest climate bill in the history of the country, and you had student loan relief. And so this is a whole series of things that make it far more likely that young people are going to show up, be engaged, and show up in this election. And I think, as Marcos was saying to me over text, is that stuff is often not well captured in the election modeling, because in general, in a midterm, because historically they don't vote that much, so therefore they stay out of the models. Well, we could be seeing, part of what we're seeing is that there could be more young people and more women in the electorate than the polling is showing. And if anything, we may be underestimating the final Democratic vote as opposed to overestimating it based on just what we're seeing, which is why I encourage you to have Tom Bonnier on in one of your future shows, because he's done really, really great data crunching on this too.
So, you mentioned earlier that Democrats were they didn't know if they could trust the data. And after 2016 and 2020, where Republicans outperformed the numbers, it's almost a little bit understandable. My theory has been that there's this nihilistic Trump vote. They're not going to talk to pollsters, right? They exist to tear down the system, and they're not talking to anybody unless it's giving them the middle finger. And so, there's this hidden vote. In 2018, they didn't turn out. So the polling was actually okay. Now, last year they turned out. So, this hope that they would not turn out if Donald Trump wasn't on the ballot, sort of, that dream died. And Republicans again outperformed the polling in New Jersey and Virginia. So I get why people would be a little bit of, just worried, can we trust these numbers? But one is we don't need to trust the numbers. We've been looking at elections. Like you said, Simon, earlier, we've been outperforming 6-7 points in actual elections. That's not polling. And a lot of the commentary that still wants to be like, well, the polling could be wrong. It's like, yeah, of course the polling could be wrong. But then we have 11 elections this year. We've seen the progression from Republicans outperforming Donald Trump by 9 points at the beginning of the year to now Democrats outperforming Joe Biden by about 6-7 points on average, because of all the things you mentioned, Simon, the Uvalde shooting and the legislation and student debt relief and the Dobbs decision overturning Roe v. Wade. So things have dramatically changed. And so the question is, we have a polling arm, Civics, so we know this challenge. And I know you do a lot of polling. Is over half of the registered voters, newly registered voters, according to Tom Bonnier, are under the age of 25. How do you poll those people? It's not possible, right? So they have a hidden vote that's impossible to poll. I think we either offset it or overperform it, but at the very least, we just don't know anymore.
Right? And a lot of these, can I just say one thing? A lot of these polls now that you're seeing coming out are going to switch or have already switched from registered voters to likely voters, and the likely voter screens are definitely not going to be, including a bunch of these new
who never voted,
new registrants.
Who've never voted. Midterm election.
So please talk about that.
Yeah, no, this stuff, we love this stuff. I hope this is interesting to your audience. Let me just say one thing. In 2016, the polling wasn't wrong. The election changed at the end, right? And this is really important. I mean, if Comey did not intervene in the election, we would have won that election comfortably by 5 or 6 points. But there was a dramatic event that changed the election in the way there was a dramatic event in this election, right? That changed the election. And so we have to be open to the idea that something could change the current trajectory of the election. And my view is that event is far more likely to be harmful to Republicans than to Democrats, but we'll see. I mean, obviously, Trump, some huge bomb could go off in the Trump world, right? Of something that he's done, the illegality and the craziness of Trump world could do something that is really off-putting and a reminder of how dangerous the Republicans have become. But I will say, Markos, what you're describing is really important, is that, there's two parts of the electorate that are most difficult to poll. And that's young people, and it's also Spanish-speaking Hispanics, Spanish-dominant Hispanics. And I think that, what you're seeing, I'm a little bit of a skeptic of this idea that there's been some kind of huge shift with Hispanic voters towards the Republican Party. And one of the reasons I think a lot of this data is wrong is that the polling, you're talking about 125-person subsamples of larger polls that almost never use Spanish. And Spanish, in this right now, we know that Spanish speakers are much more democratic than Hispanics overall. And you've got the combination of Hispanics also being very young, Markos, right? Going back to this thing that you raised, right? Yep. So there is two parts of our coalition are notoriously difficult to poll, and as is there may be a part of their coalition too. And so I think that what all polling does is that it's a guide. It doesn't tell you what's going to happen. It gives you an insight into what is happening. And all the data is sort of pointing in the same direction, right? Which is that we have the wind at our back. Things are moving in our direction. Biden's coming back up. We have a stronger closing argument than they do. And then I do want to say one final thing, which I think is not well understood yet, that I think will become better understood. I think if you look at the national polling, you see a lot more Republicans closer to 40, or in the low to mid 40s, than up closer to 50. DeSantis is the only national Republican in a competitive race that's hit 50 in the last few months since Roe ended. Kemp's under 50 in Georgia. Rubio's in the mid 40s, and most of the polls in Florida. And you see, even Abbott is under 50 in Texas in all the polls. So when you really look at the data, what you're seeing is, I think the Republicans are struggling to bring their coalition together. They only got 46% of the vote in the last 3 elections. And for them to do well, they need to not just hold what they had, but they need to gain voters or have a bunch of our folks stay home. The likelihood of our folks staying home is now significantly diminished, right?
Yeah,
And the question is, I also think they're not going to get many people to go switch. And so the question now is whether or not a MAGA-led Republican Party is struggling to even put that coalition of 46 together. And I think there's a lot of evidence in, with Vance and with Oz and with,
Vance in Ohio, Oz is in Pennsylvania.
That they are struggling to consistently get up into even to 45, 46, 47. Now, let me just drill down on that for 1 second. Part of the reason I think this is happening is because there's now a very significant national effort of Republicans to tell Republicans not to vote Republican. This is a big deal. I mean, Bill Kristol is spending $10 million in an organization of Republicans on camera talking to Republicans why they shouldn't vote Republican, right? You've seen now in Texas, in Ohio, in Pennsylvania, in Colorado, in Maryland, in New Hampshire, where leading Republicans have either endorsed Democratic candidates or come out and said, I can't support the MAGA candidate. If all of that just means 1 or 2% in this election, it could make the difference between us, winning both chambers and not. And I think that the political commentariat is, and Liz Cheney. I mean, if Liz Cheney really campaigns with Democrats, as she said she's going to do, I mean, we're talking about shaving off just a couple points here. And I think that is also being overly discounted right now. What it means that, for example, in Texas, in the lieutenant governor's race, you've now had 2 very prominent Republicans endorse a Democrat, creating a permission structure for other Republicans who are uncomfortable with MAGA to go find them. And that's what happens in these kinds of movements. The more people that jump in, right, the more people jump in. It's a permission structure. That permission structure is being created right now by national Republicans. I went on Michael Steele's broadcast. He's out there every day. Joe Scarborough, Michael Steele, Liz Cheney. We've never seen the kind of defections that we're now seeing. Yes, there were defections from Trump, but this is defections from Republicans, right? Which is a brand issue, right? And so I am optimistic that that's a more powerful dynamic than I think is being understood in the current political commentary. And even because certainly the data suggests they're struggling to pull their coalition together right now.
Yeah, I've seen. Go ahead.
No, you go.
I've seen psychological studies that changing one's political affiliation is akin to actually losing a limb. It is physically painful to change political affiliation. And if you doubt that, just imagine yourself, because everybody listening to this, almost everybody is a Democrat or a liberal progressive. Imagine having to vote for Donald Trump. Imagine the agony it would take for you to be able to pull that lever for Donald Trump. And so the permission structure Simon is talking about is actually critical because it eases that transition. And again, you may not get a lot of people, but 1 to 2%. And those college-educated suburban white women that we've been talking about the last few cycles as the only swing vote, they were Republican, and it's taking years to get them to become more consistently Democratic. And even last year in New Jersey and Virginia, they voted Republican. So it takes the process. So, but 1 to 2% when this election is this tight could be the game.
Yeah, and I remember Joe Trippi saying that when he was working on the 2018 campaign for I'm losing the guy's name for Senate in Alabama. What who he is a Democrat who won. What's his name? Markos.
We'll think of
Doug Jones.
Doug Jones.
Doug Jones. Right?
Yep.
Am I right? Yeah.
Yep.
I just remember him saying during focus groups that that the women that they were hoping would vote for him just like couldn't even get the word Democrat out of their mouth. It was like a curse word. They were Republican women who had voted Republican all their lives, and they were like, just couldn't even say the D word. It was that bad. They were like, I'm going to vote probably for, they just couldn't, like, it was so bad. But let me piggyback off of something that Simon said, which is, and I think that people have started to catch on the candidate quality of Republicans is really bad, that J.D. Vance in Ohio is an anchor so far, and that dragging him down, and that Oz, Dr. Oz in Pennsylvania is an anchor dragging him down. But what people forget is that it's not, Simon was talking about this flipping five. What's the new Senate campaign you were talking
Flippable
about?
Flippable five.
The
Yeah.
flippable five, right? Those are incumbents, right? That the Democrats are going after. It's not just the new recruits. It's the actual Republicans. It's Rubio, who I think, if I remember correctly, has never actually reached 50 in any of his Senate elections, because there's always been like a third party who's drawn some some votes. And it's Ron Johnson in Wisconsin, who the last time I checked, and it's been a few weeks, but his approvals were like in the 30s or something, just insane.
Yeah, so, he's a good candidate. By definition, he's won twice in Wisconsin. That's a good candidate.
Right. So right, exactly. So I think it's not just the candidate recruitment, it's that the whole party has been pulled so far to the right and so far out of the mainstream that even their incumbents are really in trouble now. And we've got this really aggressive that I hadn't heard of until you mentioned it, the flippable five, because I've been a little out of the loop. But anyway, yeah. So I think that even though the journalists are starting to catch on, to the candidates being, crap, that the GOP candidates in particular, but also the whole party's just moved so far that their incumbents are in trouble too. So.
Yeah, and let me echo something that Joe Trippi probably talked about when he was on, which is this notion of building this kind of grand pro-democracy coalition, where we invite 4 to 5%, 6% of the electorate to sort of temporarily join with us to, defeat MAGA, and to defeat MAGA in such a way that there becomes an incentive for the Republicans to move on to a different kind of politics. That's what we want here, right? We want to beat Republicans because we want to beat Republicans. We want to beat them badly in this election and in the next one, so that they move away from a politics that's become dangerous to the country and is a betrayal of everything that we've always believed in as Americans. And I think it's why we have to start getting creative in our thinking. I mean, if this was a parliamentary system, we would be able to absorb the Liz Cheney party. They would be a separate party. They'd be called whatever party, right? The center-right party. And they would join us, and Liz Cheney would go into our cabinet, and Bill Kristol would go work in the White House, and we'd have ways of absorbing them in a formal way, right? And we don't have that in our system. And it's why I think what happens, I think I talk about the Never Trumpers as being refugees from a country where they're now beginning to realize they're never going to go home, and that they have to start, some have gone all the way over to where Matthew Dowd is, where he's become a Democrat. Others are in this in-between place. We've got to invite these folks over to our dinner table. We have to make them feel comfortable. One of the reasons I went and did Michael Steele's podcast and Matt Lewis's podcast is that I want these people who have been courageous in taking on their party and unwilling to go along with this dangerous politics to have Democrats thanking them for what they're doing and their leadership. And I think that's going to be something we have to talk about, Markos and Kerry, about how are we really going to do this? Because we need to start thinking about how we get to 58, not just 51, right? Because that's when we start winning back the legislatures in Michigan and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, and taking the ability for them to play this crazy state legislative thing they want to do. And we sort of take that off the table temporarily while the party extracts itself away from MAGA. I may be being wildly optimistic. However, this is, what we have to start thinking differently about our politics, which is creating this sort of grand coalition with the parts of or what used to be the Republican Party, and bring them over in this sort of temporary grand coalition to defeat MAGA. I do think this is possible. I mean, Morning Joe put out a statistic today from a poll. I'm forgetting what it was, and the question was, do you believe the Republicans are trying to save America, or they're working towards destroying our democracy? 58% of voters said destroy our democracy. That's our potential ceiling, right, of where we can go if we figure out a way of bringing in these Never Trumpers into this grand coalition. It's happening organically, but I think something more formal and structural needs to happen in the coming months and years in order to make sure we're successful in this effort.
It would be quaint to go back to arguing over tax cuts for billionaires as the big
Yes.
issue. Can you imagine? So
Yeah.
we're running out of time. So I really want to look, how do we close this election? So really, Republicans are in a tough place. All the news is bad for them. Gas prices are coming down. Inflation is coming down. Job growth is still very, very strong. The war in Ukraine is going well. There's a real possibility, guys, that the big pre-election news is Russia surrenders in Ukraine. I mean, we are getting to a place where that is a real possibility. And so really, we talked about how Republicans are trying to somehow rebrand or regroup in these last few weeks. What do Democrats need to do, Simon, to close strong and to maximize this opportunity we have?
So it's a great question, and I think it's really important to recognize that the Republicans made two big strategic errors this cycle, right? One was the one we discussed by running towards MAGA. The other one was them not coming up with any kind of real agenda, any kind of olive branch to swing suburban voters to say, "See, we're not really those kinds of Republicans. Water's warm, come with us." And there was just unbelievable arrogance about that, right?
Mitch McConnell just saying, elect us and we'll get back to you. Like literally being asked, what are you going to do? And he'll say, well, once we get power, we'll tell you. I mean,
no, this was a huge error, right? I mean, and it could be that when you have a party that's overrun by extremists and extremism, they actually aren't good at making strategic and tactical decisions on how to run an election, right? And so they, and I know that McCarthy's trying now to put out this milquetoast thing later this week. I think it's too late and it's too silly, frankly, for it to have much of an impact. So I think that what's really important is that they had no plan B. They believed that Biden's low approval rating and high inflation meant that they were going to win. And what they miscalculated was this idea of all these people who had voted against them twice were just going to run into their arms, forgetting about how crazy they had been. And so that's not happening, right? We know that's not happening. And so, Markos, your question's the critical one now. Their agenda, their strategy is evaporated. Now the daily news cycle on the Republican side is unrelentingly negative, full of crazy Trump stuff, and traitorous Trump stuff that's going on. And they've sort of lost control of that, which is going to be, the fact that we've had so much infighting and Trump has called on McConnell to resign. We've never seen this kind of stuff this close to an election, this kind of ugliness of their whole offering. So their thing, I think, stays ugly and irredeemable to some degree. For us to win the midterms, though, we need to close really strong and to remind people that we've made progress during Joe Biden's presidency. When you're the incumbent party, you're graded on a simple measure, which is my life better? And I think however we make that argument, and there are many ways to make that argument. I have my own opinions, but I think it's less important about how we make it as opposed to whether we make it. We simply must close with this idea that 2 years of Democrats being in charge has made our lives and our country better. And because that is not baked into the cake right now. And what's important is that, if you think about Republican advertising right now, what information are they giving to voters they don't already have? Voters know that inflation was too high. They know the border's a mess. These are all things that are baked into the cake. I don't know that they have an ability to give voters information through advertising that they don't have, where we do. Voters don't know that the economy is better. They don't really know yet that the country's better. So I think our advertising can move the needle more, right? We can do more with our money than they can do, because there's very critical information that voters don't have that will be potentially determinative in how this election comes out. And I think that even today there was a clip where Joe Biden, a reporter who'd been covering Biden, said, it's been interesting to watch the evolution of Biden's language. He's no longer talking about the pain of inflation. He's talking about the progress we've made. Things are better, right? That's a huge shift in tone. And again, it gets to this thing we were talking about earlier, is confidence, right? I don't think Democrats thought they had done a good job. Now I think there's a strong argument that we've done it. We have done not just a good job, but a really good job. These have been 2 historic years, because not only is the country better post-COVID, we're beating Russia and all these things, but the investments that we've made are going to create jobs and opportunity for workers for decades beyond. We have so much to run on. And I just want to perhaps close to your audience to think, listen, all the reasons you're going to make your phone calls and do your texting and give your money and all the things we're going to do to try to move the needle, Look at what we just did with 2 years of power. We've only had control of Washington for 6 years out of the last 42 years. Imagine if we get 2 more years, all the good we can do. And I hope that that's as much of a motivator for all of us as the fear of the other side. Because I just think we demonstrated that even with our crazy, dysfunctional, center-left Democratic Party, right, we can come together and get big shit done, and put points on the board for the American people. We know that now. Give us 2 more years. Think about what we can do together.
Absolutely.
Kerry, that sounds like a good closing soliloquy, huh?
Yeah. I mean, how do we improve upon that? Right?
Yeah, no, I can't. Simon Rosenberg, he's the your executive director. Is that the title?
Just whatever. El Jefe. El Jefe.
New Democrat Network, old time friend. Thank you so much. Oh, what's your do you have anything to pitch?
Yeah, and just my Twitter handle is Simon WDC. Please follow. It's where I do too much writing. I spend too much time on Twitter, I will admit. And my website is ndn.org. And you can watch a video of my presentation about the election there. And also, I do a daily update on the election that's live and updated first thing every morning, looking at new polling information. So lots of resources there on the NDN site if you want to check it out.
I definitely recommend following Simon on Twitter, and get regularly checking it for his updates, because it's powerful. It's grounded in facts and data, and it makes you feel good. So, get your cup of coffee in the morning, whatever's your pleasure, and then dig into some of the new numbers that he's talking about there,
but not cope good. It's actually because the news is good. It's
right.
It is good. And listen, I just will my final point is we just have to learn and spend more time being proud of our party and proud of our president. And I think that we're really rough on one another in our little family. And I think that compared to the other side, holy moly, have we been a force for good now for decades, even generations. And we've got to live more in that, in those achievements than we do in the disappointments. And I think this is part of something we have to learn and get better at, because, I do believe that in politics, you have to say, look, we've come a long way. We've got a long way to go, but you got to start with, we've come a long way. Right? To show that you actually, when you're given power, that you can make things better. And by spending so much time talking about all the things we don't do, as opposed to all the things we do, I think we're selling ourselves short every day. This has been an amazing party. I'm proud to have been part of it for my whole life. And, this battle ahead of us is one of the most important since we've all been in the game. So please do everything you can to make sure that we have a good, that we win the midterms. That has to be the aspiration now, is we have to win the midterms.
Right.
Simon Rosenberg, El Jefe of New Democrat Network, NDN. Thank you so very much for joining us. That was amazing. Thanks.
Thank you.
Kerry, it's good talking to somebody who actually saw this coming and was able to read the data and understood the situation and wasn't caught up in this history says that the party in power loses seats in the midterm. And it's true. History can be indicative of conditions, but it's not determinative. And if you ignore the broader dynamics of what was happening in the country, it was easy to see that this was never going to be a typical midterm election. Just like we could see in 2001 after 9/11 that 2002 would not be a typical midterm election. I mean, should be obvious, but it wasn't.
It's really, one of the things that I heard Simon talk about on the Michael Steele podcast too, and I think this is true, is that Twitter has sort of increased the herd mentality of journalists, and particularly Washington journalists, right? Because you get such strong reactions so quickly that if you go outside the mainstream, if you go against what everybody else is saying, then there's just a huge price to pay for that. And I can just tell you,
risk. Yeah,
I get risk, right? I can just tell you after reporting in Washington for a little under a handful of years, how strong that even before Twitter had really gained, because this was in 2009, 2010, 2011, 12, before Twitter had really, really gained the traction that it has now. And it was there, but it just wasn't quite as strong. That already the pull to kind of go along
Yeah.
with the conventional wisdom, the groupthink in Washington was so real. And I fortunately was able to kind of stay out of that to some extent, because I was reporting on a constituency that just had different interests than everybody else. And I didn't think of myself as, I'm here to be objective about whether or not, LGBTQ people deserve their rights. No, I wasn't objective about that. What I was trying to figure out was what the hell the Obama administration was doing, and be clear with my constituency, the people that were reading me, that I was reporting for, whether or not that was really happening. And, the promises that he had made, he was trying to keep, et cetera. So it insulated me to some extent. But man, if you have an idea that is outside of what everybody else is saying, and in LA, everybody wants to be pretty. Everybody's pretty and wants to be pretty, right? Everybody wants to be smart in DC. It's a nerdy culture. Everybody wants to be smart. Everybody wants to be seen as smart. No one wants to be the person who is, saying something different and then turns out to be wrong, right? So,
yeah, it's safe to be wrong if everybody else is wrong. It's
right,
like the water buffalo herd. You're safe in that.
It's
map,
much safer. It's
as
much
opposed
safer.
to the one that walks off by itself and gets mauled by the lions, right?
Yeah, and it's just a reinforcing thing in there. And I always often say that DC is the place where good ideas go to die. So like, I just think that the pundits got ahead of themselves, and they were so convinced that this was the narrative based on historical trends. And as you and I have been saying all you had to do was look at the Democrats being able to win those 2 seats in Georgia, just to know that these were 2 Senate seats in Georgia in the special elections, or the runoffs in Georgia just after the 2020 elections. That these are ahistorical times, that there's always the possibility that things don't go at all. That was like, then we had an insurrection. Then abortion, which has been for 50 years. We've gone through this stuff before, but there was always the possibility that this was just going to be very different. And the pundits just refused to go there. And the more one pundit said it, the more the other pundits said it.
And Kerry, the fact that it was a bunch of men, dominated by men, who clearly, like, oh, the electorate doesn't care. This will pass. That's what so many said.
Mostly white men.
Yeah, white men. Dobbs will pass by election time. And and I think you're right. If you're a woman in that world, do you really want to? You're already a target.
Yeah.
Do you really want to stand out on that limb? And so it's easier for us because we're partisans and we can be objective about the situation. And we'll talk about when things are going poorly just as much as we'll talk about when things are going well. But we could examine the dynamics. We could examine the reasons midterms suck for incumbent parties, and that's because they're referendums on the incumbent. And we can then analyze the broader picture. And again, we knew abortion was going to happen. We knew Trump wasn't going to step off the stage. And so it was obvious that this wouldn't be. Now, we never said Democrats are going to win.
Right.
But we said this is not a red wave guaranteed loss. Like, things are going to happen and it's going to be weird.
Right.
And we should be ready for that. And so, and again, Simon was one of the few people that saw that. Joe Trippi as well, who ran Howard Dean's campaign. He's been on the show. He was one of the few people who saw these dynamics. And it's telling that all, those two guys are partisans, right? They're not trying to safely ensconce themselves in like DC intelligentsia. Like they were looking at data, they were looking at numbers, they were looking at the big picture, just like we were. And we all came to that same conclusion. And now I'm glad everybody's with us. I'm glad that narrative is mostly dead.
Because even though we were out there, even people in our own party were sort of like, that's happy talk. You know what I mean? Like, So we were out there on a limb, and they were out there on a limb. And Simon was out there on a limb, right there in DC. I don't actually know where he's based, but like,
in DC, no, he's across the White House in DC. So
yeah.
So thanks everybody. That is our show, Kerry. It's such a pleasure to have you back. It's so exciting.
Yay!
Looking forward to closing out this election season. We're going to have so much to talk about in these coming weeks. Thanks to Walter for producing the show. Thanks to Kara and Dorothy and Paul for all the work they do behind the scenes. And thank you, the reader and the viewer and the listener, for joining us every week to talk about what's important in our country and to sort of battle for our democracy. Because again, I keep saying this every week. This is not about taxes for billionaires. I wish that's what we were arguing about. This is literally about our democracy. And it's not just the House and the Senate, but it's state legislatures, it's governorships, Secretary of States, attorney generals, up and down that ballot. We all have to go out. We have to work hard. And we have to take advantage of this opportunity that the Republicans and the Republican Supreme Court has given us to dramatically reshape what our country can look like. So it's either DC statehood, Puerto Rico statehood, voter rights, abandoned to partisan gerrymandering, or it's the destruction of our democracy if Republicans take over.
Right.
So really
find a way to get involved. I mean, you know, even if it's just one race, like even if it's city council in your city, like find a way to get involved, because every person that you help turn out or every person that you help convince is one more person for the state, you know, one more person for, you know, so just like it builds on itself. So you don't have to go crazy, but if you have time, go crazy.
Yeah.
Do
5
the text,
people.
do the phone calls. Yeah, 5 people. Turn them out.
5 people.
Yep.
Find 5 people, get them to turn out. You would do more for our democracy than almost, you know, vast majority of people. So thank you so much for joining us. Talk to you next week.